Hello, everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Crystal. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm co-facilitating today with Hazel. I am the Senior Manager of Workplace Experience, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for a tech company here in Portland, Oregon, called Approved. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It was a big part of my childhood, gaming and video games. So I think this is going to be awesome. And Hazel, off to you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining today's discussion. My name is Hazel Valdez. I am the Associate Director for the Oregon Bioscience Incubator. And what that basically means is I work with a bunch of folks who are scientists and researchers who have a product or thing or service that they're hoping to go to market with. And the incubator helps them by facilitating resources, lab equipment, and highlighting them to venture capital companies and investors who might potentially help them become another, big company of some kind, hopefully a public one day. Our goal is to foster entrepreneurship in the bioscience and digital health space, as well as create and promote the bioscience digital health ecosystem for the state of Oregon. So with that, I'd love for our panelists to come on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Lizardo. My pronouns are she, her. I am a design technologist for Reality Labs, where my day-to-day involves creating prototypes of AR, VR experiences. And my career background started with making games for augmented reality, but over the years that has developed to and also incorporate making, not only games, but also tools and experiences for wearable headsets.
All right, Zach.
Hi, I'm Zach. Use he or they pronouns. I am currently a VR UI UX designer at Vicarious Surgical, and previously I worked on games such as Supernatural, a VR fitness game for the Oculus Quest, and Wonderscope, an AR storytelling app on iOS. Yeah, and right now I work mostly with on personal projects, like personal indie games. Yeah, working with organizations like the IGDA Foundation, as part of their grantees that get scholarships to go to things like GDC and stuff like that.
Pretty cool. Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate Edwards. I prefer she and her. I am a almost 28-year veteran of the industry come this April. I'm a geographer who's been doing culturalization work in the game industry for many, many years. I spent 13 years at Microsoft. I'm currently the executive director of the Global Game Jam, which kicks off today. So yay, world's largest game creation event. I used to run the International Game Developers Association, the IGDA, but I still have been doing my consulting work on many games forever now, and just doing all kinds of projects. And yeah, so that's basically what I do.
Well, thank you all so much for being part of today's panel. We appreciate it. I think when Crystal and I were formulating what we would do to start off the year, we wanted to do something kind of out of the box, but really in mainstream, which kind of leads me to my first question. This is about authentic representation in the gaming industry for LGBTQIA+. So let's go right at it here. First question: pop culture has always had the ability to influence people, and gaming is part of that culture. Do you think that the LGBTQ2IA+ games are well represented, or are only dominant cultures being represented? Kate, let's start with you.
I would say that, especially for the length of time I've been in this industry, I would say it's absolutely been getting better. But it really depends on what kind of games you're looking at. So if you look in the indie game space, you see a lot of fantastic representation happening because indie games really, let's face it, they are where, in my view, a lot of the real innovation in the game industry is taking place, because they're giving people a canvas for self-expression that does not typically happen at the larger game level, like what we call AAA games, like all the major franchises. But even in those games, we've seen a lot of progress. So like, for example, BioWare has been one of my clients for many years. And I think the Dragon Age franchise is a good example where they have made great strides in better representation. And like the work that we're currently doing on Dragon Age 4 is really exciting to me in terms of what they're doing, basically building upon what they've already done in previous versions of the game, to make it even more inclusive. So I think companies, in my view, they have gotten the message. They understand what they need to do, but getting there is a little bit glacial at the large AAA level, but it's a lot more agile at the indie level.
Glacial is a very good descriptor right there. Lauren, what do you think?
I agree with Kate. I mean, there's a lot of indie games that are, you have a lot of queer storylines, queer characters coming from video games, especially from like indies. But there is also, AAA studios who are also incorporating more inclusive aspects in their games, like The Last of Us. I won't go with spoilers, but The Last of Us and Dragon Age, and there's like, it could get better. It could be better, but I feel like we're just on our way currently.
Zach?
Yeah, I definitely agree. But it's also kind of like, for me, important to notice that like, even though they aren't like always the biggest things that people always talk about, some of the biggest games that have been released recently do have queer kind of like undertones or even themes or characters, like Last of Us, for example, but things like Hades and Undertale, which were huge games that people just loved, and there were queer themes. Sometimes they're talked about, sometimes they're not, but for the most part, the games were just good. And those things are just kind of happening over and over again. And that's kind of how things get into culture, the normalization of that, and the fact that it is becoming better, and like there is more and more of this representation, and people aren't shying away from it, whether that's on the developer sides, but also on kind of like the consumer side as well.
I will say, before I forget, to the audience, if you are new to gaming or don't understand all the acronyms in gaming, our wonderful volunteer Roger did put up a link with regards to a glossary of terms for learning some common lingo in there. So check it out if you have some time. It's great that, for a lot of us, we work in a lot of acronyms and we tend to be siloed in that way. So we'd like to share that with everyone. So it's out there for you if you need it. Okay, so as game developers, then do you approach storytelling to represent all walks of life, or is it really more game specific? Let's start with Lauren.
In my experience, like professionally, I don't have experience in story-driven games. Like I said before, I started off my career like making games, but it was more catered towards like the tech, so augmented reality over, that was prioritized over the stories of the games. But the small amount of like influence that I have for games are like, video game one-liners, like for, Global Game Jam. So for those games and like the stories in it, if the story fits, I made it a point to make it more gender neutral in its language.
How about you, Zach?
Yeah, so I think for me at least, there's not really a way to cover all topics in one game. I think that's that's a recipe for failing to finish your game. But I think the important thing is to really be aware of kind of like what the wider world is, and kind of make sure that you're accommodating for that. Like, not necessarily like queer focused, but like, is it necessary that all your characters be white, for example, or is that just the default that you have without actually having a basis in what's actually in like your player base, or in the wider world? And kind of like also more focused towards queer things. It's like, for me personally, a lot of reasons why I started making my own games and wanting to have kind of more representation on that side was because like it's very hard to find queer representation in storylines that aren't kind of like trauma based. Like, where are my happy kind of queers? That's not necessarily something that happens very often. But even outside of storytelling, I think there's some things to do with like how you consider players and even like the mechanics of what you're creating. For instance, like I worked on a fitness app. I wouldn't necessarily say that it has like amazing storytelling or whatever, but one thing that I really pushed for, since I am part of like the design team, was to kind of consider like what are the things that we're kind of embedding into the mechanics as we design this game. For instance, fitness and trans folk have a pretty like fraught relationships, because a lot of kind of like the trauma around being trans can be kind of linked to like bodies and kind of similar things that kind of fitness exacerbates a lot. So how are we kind of accommodating for that in the way that we talk about our users? How are we kind of accommodating that in the way that we kind of measure metrics? What are those things that we are kind of able to design that aren't necessarily to do with storytelling, but definitely impact the user experience?
So lived experience is part of that universalism when you're going to design them. Yeah. Kate, what do you think?
Well, I agree with both Lauren and Zach's comments. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth there. I mean, in the work that I do with a lot of the companies that I advise, the focus is to really kind of get them out of the assumptions and stereotypes that they like to pull off their mental shelf. And a lot of times I don't think they're doing it maliciously or intentionally. They're doing it out of ignorance or frankly creative laziness, because they're under incredibly tight time schedules. And so they're just like, I need to do this and I want to do this. You know, I want to have a queer character, for example, but I don't have the time to invest to do it right, but I do want to have one. So therefore, I'm just going to do something. And oftentimes that's where we have some of the bigger problems show up. And so oftentimes, like I think like Zach mentioned, which I think was a great point, it's challenging their assumptions about the characters they're creating, about the narrative that they're generating. Like, does this squad, even if it's a first-person shooter game, do they all have to be dudes? Do they all have to be a certain race? Do they all have to be whatever? And usually the answer is, if you push just a little hard on the designers or on the narrative designers and say, does it have to be the case? Is there a narrative reason for this? Sometimes there is, and they have a good narrative reason. You're like, okay, that makes sense. Now I understand where you're coming from. But most of the time, the majority, it's like there is no good narrative reason. They're just working within their comfort zone, especially because I think they want to, and this is a desire I have found among a lot of people who are on the creative core teams. They want to have better representation of underrepresented groups, but they are basically scared of doing it wrong, and so they don't do it at all. And so this is where I'm happy to say more and more companies are realizing, well, that can't be a barrier. So therefore, let's reach out to the community, let's reach out to sensitivity readers and other people who can represent those voices and have them advise us on the correct representation. And that tends to be the norm today, especially on the larger games that I work on, like the larger AAA titles. A lot of companies take it really seriously, so they do reach out and they do get people to advise, and I think that's absolutely the right way to do it.
You know, this industry is huge, and I can't even fathom the amount of money. I think when over last year, Crystal and I discovered a channel that literally was like the battle of games. I'm like, there are teams, there are people being paid to do this. This is amazing. How come I didn't get into it? That was my first question, but that's another story. In this industry, do you all think, I'd love to hear your opinion, is there a burgeoning queer games movement? Zach, what do you think?
I think it already exists and it's always been there. Kind of queer games have definitely been part of the scene ever since video games really have existed, as long as queer game devs have been involved in making games. So there's actually a group that has put together the LGBTQ video game archive, and they have records from games from like the 1970s and have like over 1,200 queer games listed. Like I think it's always like a misconception that like, oh, it's like becoming like a thing. But the thing is, like, it's always been a thing. You just haven't heard of it because you're probably not necessarily one of the people who has been actively searching for these things. Like, I think as long as queer game devs have been wanting to find each other and all of that, there has always been a movement. And I think also, I think it's just becoming more and more talked about because it's coming more and more into the AAA games, which means it's reaching a larger kind of like consumer audience. And more people are seeing that queer folk exist in their favorite media. Like queer folks both see like representation mass media, but also kind of like, I guess, the bigots start complaining, and it just becomes this great thing for video game writers to start talking about. So it feels like, oh, it's this new and new movement coming out, but really it's just it's just like the movement finally getting some airtime. Yeah.
Zach, I'd love for you if you could find that to share that link in
Yeah.
chat. That would be awesome. Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I wouldn't call it a movement per se. What I do think, I'd go back to my earlier comment about how we're seeing, especially in the indie game space, that the tools to create games have become so democratized and universal, and you can download free versions of Unity and Unreal, and most game tools out there have a free version that anybody can download and start playing with. And I've met tons of people who are self-taught, even junior high and high school students who just make these remarkable games in their free time. And so the talent is out there, and I think game development has become to the point where it has become a pretty ubiquitous form of self-expression, in much the same way you can go to an art store and buy some brushes and paint and canvas and just start doing your thing. And so you can do that now with the digital tools. And because of that, we are seeing the better representation of all the voices who did not get represented in a lot of like the mainstream games, like the real commercialized games. And I think that's a great trend. So now we're seeing more games that, which we tend to call them in the indie space, but just from an artistic perspective, we're seeing a lot of games that I think are just these beautiful forms of self-expression about my life experience or their life experience, which you can only capture basically from that person, from their voice. So I tend to agree. I don't really see it as a movement per se, but I think the visibility of all of those efforts is becoming greater because of that democratization. And I think it's great. And I think it is getting more attention, as it should.
Lauren?
I'm gonna echo Zach and Kate. I don't feel like there's like a declared movement. It's just as long as what Zach said, as long as queer developers have been around, that's how long queer games have been around. And to piggyback off what Kate said too, it's like Unity. Well, I like Unity. I'm a Unity fan, but Unity is like such a one of the tools that someone can just pick up and go online to look up tutorials and learn how to use. And it's becoming easier for people to use video games to express themselves. And I think that's why a movement of is feeling like it's being recognized in the industry, just because it's becoming those stories are being told mostly in indies, but also it is reaching the AAA games too.
Lauren, is Unity a developer engine?
Yes, it's a game engine. My primary engine. Another one would be Unreal by Epic Games, and there are some free ones as well. Like I know Godot engine is a free, an open source game engine to make games.
Man, I'm learning a lot. I work with an org called Saturday Academy. I'm like, how can I get a game developing class for the kids? That would be awesome. All right. Well, again, learning a lot always. The whole goal here is to give representation and kind of throw it out there for the world to hear. The accessibility of game development tools and corresponding growth of indie games for the, say, the LGBT community storylines brings about, like, I want to say, more opportunity to deliberately design games with particular social impacts in mind. What do you all think corporate executives think about that notion? Will it sell to consumers, or will they buck towards dominant storytelling for a game? With the on the heel of the fact that Activision Blizzard just got bought out by good old Microsoft for 65 billion in cash, how do you feel about all that, Kate?
It's interesting because I've kind of lived in both worlds, because having run the International Game Developers Association and then running Global Game Jam, which both communities are like 90% indie. But then I've also worked a lot of the consulting work I do. In fact, the majority of it is with large AAA game companies like Microsoft, like EA and others. And so I kind of have this, these two perspectives going on. I think they are compatible in many ways. I mean, we saw during the last generation of consoles that Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, they all embraced the indie community on their platforms. And I think a big reason for that is because they recognize the fact that that is where the innovation is happening. That's where they're seeing amazing new approaches to game design, amazing representation of themes and people and culture that was not happening at the large AAA franchise level. And so they embraced it for that, because they saw where the future is. And I know a lot of these executives. I used to work with Phil Spencer when I was at Microsoft. I'm still friends with Phil Spencer, and so I know his approach to this. I know he has a very inclusive mindset, both in the workplace and in the content that they want to develop. So I'm actually somewhat optimistic about the acquisition of Activision Blizzard being under Microsoft's umbrella. Especially, I'm really hoping for the employees there have a much better life than they have had under the previous or the current CEO. May he go rot in hell. Anyway, I do think, though, that it's not really a contention, I guess is what I'm getting at. I do think that people, especially executives who are in more of that large AAA space, are understanding kind of the wind change, and they understand the momentum and where it's going and what consumers are wanting. And you're always going to have a certain segment of consumers who want a certain thing. Like, they're always going to want that next Call of Duty or whatever shooter it is or something. But then they also understand, and I think this is what the big change in just the last, I would say, even 5 years, there has been, I think, a common understanding among people who are at that in those large companies, that your growth as a company, your growth in terms of the appeal of games, is not going to happen with the avid fervent game players. It's going to happen with the casual players, the mobile players. It's going to happen with the people who want their stories told rather than the same old story over and over again, which is let's go shoot something else. And so I think there's a recognition that they have to strive for diversity and representation. They have to strive for diversity in game types, and also in the largest definition of inclusion, which is not just gender, race, etc. It also relates to geography, culture, language, and all these other forms of inclusion.
Lauren.
Sorry, I clicked I clicked the wrong button. Yeah, well, I don't have the perspective of what it's like to be on the side of the corporate execs. I'm just basing this off of like Twitter, game dev Twitter. That, like, I feel like if what corporate execs care about is profits, like, mold that language so that they would care about it. So, if the goal is to have more inclusiveness in their products, including that in a game could reach other demographics and therefore reach, higher profits.
Zach.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have to agree. I mean, as I mentioned before, there's kind of like no evidence that like including, for instance, like queer themes is going to put the large base of consumers off, considering some of the largest games that have created so much revenue have had queer games, like again, like The Last of Us, Mass Effect, like Hades is a more recent kind of like game. Like obviously it's something that the market is kind of like looking for, but like as both Kate and Lauren kind of said, it's all about like how do we justify the risk of doing these things. And I think that's kind of why they've been leaning pretty heavily on like the indie space as a place for these things to kind of come out of. They're very willing to help indie games have breakthroughs and create lots of revenue on their platforms. They're significantly less willing in many ways to take on that risk for themselves because then that involves them investing the money that might not come back to them. But I do think, I think it's definitely possible as kind of, as Kate kind of mentions, that the consumer base makes it more and more clear that this is what we're looking for. So like, people are always going to want another Assassin's Creed game or whatever the big franchise is. So kind of like these AAA game companies are always going to be making these because they know it brings in bank. So the thing that's going to really push them to change some of that formula is showing them that like, hey, like the consumers are looking for this other aspect that you haven't included in your AAA games. It's not going to be that huge of a lift. We're not changing the core of your series or anything like that. But hey, more representation is good representation. So
True.
please include it. So yeah, it's all about like making them understand that the risk is worth it.
I've got a follow-up question for Kate on this one. You sort of mentioned it when you responded to my first question here. Can you tell us more about how you're referencing or what you mean by the term culturalization in gaming? I read an article in The Gamer and you were very much, you stressed that. I'd love to hear what that is all about.
Sure. So basically, back in the days when I left Microsoft in 2005 to become self-employed as a consultant, I started adopting the term culturalization as a contrast to localization, because a lot of people in tech, of course, and in games know the term localization, which typically means language translation. You're basically, translating from English to whatever language, or from whatever language to English, and so on. And that has always been a really important part of adapting content and making it inclusive for people around the world, is to do the language translation. But culturalization, the approach that I take, is basically in looking at the game and the experience as a kind of holistic experience. You're building a world, you're inviting people into this world, and within this world there are all kinds of things that have cultural cues. There's characters, there's symbols, there's architecture, there's narrative, there's allegory, there's all kinds of things that happen in this space that can evoke either, hopefully for most people, a positive reaction, saying, wow, I love this game, it's really fun. But for some people, depending on what was put into that environment to build it out, they might see something that might be from their culture or resonates with their particular demographic or socioeconomic background or whatever it is, that basically creates a situation where now they're not thinking about the game and the immersive experience. They're now thinking about, why did they put this in the game? They're like picking on me, or there's something about this, like, why did they put my culture's symbol in their game when it has no reason to be there? Or why are they using this gesture, which means the middle finger in my country? Or why are they, et cetera, et cetera? Why did they pick in a fantasy game, they have this battle going on, but I can clearly see that it's an allegory for a battle that took place, in my region in the 18th century, which is really controversial. So why did they do that? And all of those are real examples, by the way. And so I take a look at all of those things from a really top-down approach. A lot of the work I do with games, it starts at the beginning, unlike localization, which tends to happen towards the end because they have to wait for the text content to be final so they can do the translation. I sit down very early with the writers and the artists and the producers to talk about what world are you building, who's in it, what do they do, how does the player interact with them, all of these different assumptions that they're making, the design choices, talking about inclusive design of the characters, of the environments and everything. So basically it's really looking at it across the board, saying my goal, what it really is to maximize the ability of this game to be enjoyed by as many people around the world as possible. So I don't want to have their game basically being banned by a government or rejected by a certain cultural group because the game designers put something in there, usually out of pure ignorance, not out of malice. That's almost never happened. Actually only happened twice in my entire career where somebody did something purposefully to piss off a specific group. And that's because they maintain some really strong biases of their own. So that's basically what I'm doing. And it's kind of a task that I did when I was at Microsoft. I kind of fell backwards into doing that work as a geographer in a tech company. And then I basically said, this is it. This is my life's calling. I love doing this work. So this is what I'm going to do. So, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's fantastic. Y'all, I know we've been talking, chat has kind of blown up a bit and we have quite a few questions, which is great. Well, I love engagement. I'm going to turn it to Crystal, and we're going to, before we go to our last question that Crystal's going to ask you all, I would love for Crystal to kind of do the Q&A and kind of you all can think about it and pipe up if you tell us what you think.
Yeah, we have several questions. I'm so glad to see all these come up. I have Jeffrey said that they're volunteer lead for the Pride group at a gaming company, and they've seen strides from the company in the last 2 years, but there's still progress to be made. Do you have suggestions on how to convince the business mindset of big company to invest into representation and the queer community as a whole?
If you don't mind, I'd love to respond to this because it's exactly the same thing I had to do at Microsoft when I was working there. Because when I decided that, I was going to start doing this culturalization effort within the company, people didn't automatically buy what I was doing. They're just like, because I was approaching it from the standpoint that we're doing it because we want to respect the local culture. We want to respect who these people are as individuals and basically, do our best to respect who they are. That didn't go anywhere. People are like, yeah, that's nice. And of course, we're talking about back in the, early 90s. What did work, however, and still works today, is basically using, whether we like it or not, I had to pivot and use the money argument. It's like, why is it important? Because the more you invest in representation, the more you invest in especially, highlighting underrepresented groups, you are opening up the game to a broader appeal, which therefore means potentially more revenue. And that is a language that every business dev person always understands. I've never had anybody reject it and say, well, I don't want to make more money. Yeah, that's crazy. It's when you kind of couch it in those terms that really it's basically broadening the appeal of the content, especially, elevating representation of certain groups that we choose as, part of the narrative. Usually they understand that argument where you say, okay, now I get it. Okay, it makes sense to me. And that typically, whether we like it or not, that's the argument that's the only one that's really worked for me.
Kate or Lauren or Zach, do you have any thoughts?
I'll be completely honest. I'm very bad at playing politics. I definitely echo a lot of what Kate says. Definitely, you have to kind of get on their kind of level and speak their language. Otherwise, they're not going to care about it. On the other hand, in my kind of point of view, being someone who worked at a very junior level within a company, and obviously I'm not the kind of person who can kind of go up to these business folks and be like, hey, let's talk representation in business. I'd probably get laughed out of the room as a junior designer in many cases, regardless of what company I would work at. I think at that point, a lot of what I ended up focusing on was, hey, one, what are the tasks that I am kind of working on? Are they things that hey, I feel comfortable working with. If it's not, is it something I can really push back on? And I did this a lot with kind of like the design aspects that I was part of. Like, I mean, I did work at a startup, so I did have a decent amount of say, unlike working in a lot of big companies where you might not have that kind of option as much. But kind of pushing what your bosses are trying to think, like your direct bosses, that can kind of make its way up the food chain a little bit, as long as you can justify all of your choices. And on the other hand as well, like look into other aspects of the business that like you might be able to have a little bit more impact at. For me, I was pretty involved with like the social marketing kind of group. I helped them create assets or whatever. So at some point I was like, hey, it's like Pride Month. What about we do something that actually speaks to queer members of the community? Like, is there a possibility of making a social media post that kind of highlights good things, like not just like what a lot of companies do, which is like, oh, let's like make a rainbow logo, but like what else can we actually say about a product that actually speaks to concerns of the community? And I managed to kind of convince them like, hey, like I'm totally willing to put myself out there. I'm totally willing to say like, hey, I'm a trans dev working on this product. Like, this is how we've designed it. So if you're a trans person, you would be interested in using this product. And again, it's like it's good for the company, but it's also good for representation. So again, it's like trying to find those small things that like won't necessarily be like the make it or break it issues in terms of like representation on the level of these big company execs, but what are those small things that you, even like if you're a junior designer on a team, can actually impact and improve? Because sometimes the small things that really do matter.
I'm going to kind of follow this up, and Lauren, I know you've been listening, so I'm going to address this to you. This is a follow-up question that I think kind of goes to what Kate and Zach have just said, but the chat question is, it's from Tamiko Little. I'd be interested to hear perspectives on whether the panelists feel like streamers are having an impact on developing more diverse games. What are your thoughts, Lauren?
I think they do. I feel like, you know, especially I feel like streamers, especially on Twitch, they do have an impact on developers because they get, you know, Twitch streamers can reach like such a big audience that, you know, games that they play, that they stream on Twitch, it reaches that audience, and the audience can give feedback or talk about the game while they play it. And yeah, developers are listening. I mean, not from like a personal standpoint, because the games that I produced were not that big, but you know, like yeah, they're listening, they're watching, and I feel like they are considering, you know, the audience that the streamers are able to reach.
So impact is definitely happening. All right, we have a ton of questions. So Crystal, what's the next one?
Libra's asking, can you tell us what game you found yourself seeing? In which game you found yourself seeing?
Ooh, good question. Kate?
Well, mine's kind of obvious because it's I know the person who was the head designer for the game For Honor that was produced. It came out a few years ago. And when they introduced the Norse group within the game For Honor, he actually introduced a large female warrior character who's in the game. And because he knows I cosplay as Thor and I'm 6'3", he basically literally made me be seen. So he added to For Honor in the Norse group that was basically based on me, and so that was kind of a literal being seen, so which was cool. I mean, it was fun. It was very flattering that he chose to do that.
I love that.
Yeah, Lauren.
I want to say, I'm gonna say, tell me why. And this is more on like not just, you know, having queer characters in that video game, but also like a person of color. You'll notice in Tell Me Why there's a restaurant and they have like a sign outside for like their menu, and you can tell it's a Filipino restaurant, and I thought that was amazing. Like lumpia is on the sign. That's, come on. And then having to like being given the ability to pursue romantic relationships or not amongst the characters is huge. I think that's amazing that, like, you know, just because you're playing as a male identifying character doesn't mean you have to pursue a romantic relationship with a female identifying person. And I feel like that is more common in games, or becoming more common in games now. But yeah, I think that is like having that ability to just, the ability of choosing is what makes me feel seen.
How about you, Zach?
I will definitely say I'm blanking like right off the bat. I personally like the game that kind of comes to mind for me right now is just like I really enjoyed playing Hades because nothing was like super overt. Like the storyline isn't necessarily the focus of the game. Like a lot of it's all about the mechanics. It's a roguelike, which means you keep going through these rooms and blasting through them, and I'm really bad at them. But what really like sold me on Hades was like how they weave this narrative into it. And there just happened to be some queer characters, and it kind of subverts the idea of like what these like ancient gods could be. Like, what does that interpretation look like for folks who are like living in today's society where everything is international, and like it doesn't have to be limited to like what the Greeks and Romans thought necessarily like their gods look like, especially since like the world is so much bigger now. So like having that kind of representation, and also like being able to see like these queer romances that are like still pretty tragic, but it's like you help them sort their relationship issues out, and like the relationship itself wasn't like toxic. It's just the situation was all around bad, and you help solve that. And that was kind of like a nice, sweet kind of like relationship to read about. Also, the fact that you can choose to romance either Meg or Thanatos, very hard decision. Yeah, it's just like figuring out what are the ways that we can kind of explore narrative in interesting ways that don't always have to circle the idea that like, oh, this is like a very explicit choice that you have to make in this critical part of the story. Like it can just be like a side story while you enjoy the rest of the game. So yeah, I really enjoyed Hades for that.
Thank you. Crystal, there are a ton of
We
questions.
have so many questions. I know we're not going to get to all of them. So I'm going to do one more, and then we have our final question for the
Panel.
day. So I'm going to go as a sensitivity reader, how do you provide constructive feedback, criticism in cis educational without getting people defending their own bias. One of the panelists mentioned ignorance based disrespect or bias that happens.
I think that was Zach.
Yeah,
Communicate.
I mentioned that as well.
Yeah.
Either way,
one.
I mean, I mean, I'm happy to respond on that because that basically is the crux of the work that I do, is providing that kind of feedback. And normally, if they get to the point where they actually hire you as a sensitivity reader, usually they're already acknowledging the fact that they need your input. And so typically in my experience, like if I get a company hiring me, like I just had a call like immediately before this panel with a company I worked with before, and they're reaching out to me again on an issue that they're dealing with. And I know this company well enough. They reach out to me when they know they've reached the limits of their understanding. And so they're basically like, hey, we need your help. You know, we can't go any further with this. And I appreciate that because it means that they're open. They're open to being educated. They're open to be, and of course, I don't talk down to them, but I see every single interaction I have with anyone I work with on the developer side as a teachable moment. And I always do it in kind of a gentle way. I don't try and, you know, really hit them over the head with for their ignorance, even though that I'm tempted, trust me, many, many times. And yeah, there are very few times where I actually get into heated arguments with people because their biases really come to the surface. And I'm just like, you know, okay, it's more than teachable. Now, you know, now it's like switches into debate mode. But really, as a consultant, it's like, look, you either need my help or you don't need my help. If you need my help, then listen to what I'm saying, take my feedback to heart, really try and understand. If you don't understand something I've written or the feedback I've given you, please ask me. I'm happy to explain it again, you know, and get into more detail. The hard part, I think, for us, for people who are doing this work, is to kind of have to grit our teeth and not really express what we're really feeling about what they did, and basically say, okay, remember, these people are doing this typically, in my experience, 99%, it's out of ignorance, not out of malice. So it's like, here's a chance for me to kind of elevate their understanding of the issue, and I'll do my best to do that without berating them. Now, if they ultimately choose to reject your feedback, then basically your hands are clean. I mean, there's nothing you can do. And as I learned from all my legal friends and lawyer friends when I worked at Microsoft, as long as you have it in writing, make sure you have that email communication that you made your recommendation and then they rejected your recommendation in writing, then you've got it. It's like, hey, it's not my problem. If this goes, you know, if this falls apart for you, I did my part. I gave you the advice, you ignored it, I'm moving on. And that's the best you can do. And it's frustrating, but you know, it happens sometimes.
Yeah, I kind of want to follow that up and also say like a lot of like, I really appreciate Kate, you sharing your feedback on like, definitely like when these large companies kind of come to you. I guess like my perspective is more of like on the junior end of like, what else can I do? Sometimes because it can definitely feel a little bit perilous at times, where you're like, oh, I just keep getting things handed down to me. So what are the things that you can really do? And I think the biggest thing for me that really helps was like understanding what the kind of decision-making pipeline looks like, understanding who is making decisions, what do they care about, and who in that pipeline is open to receiving feedback if you come across something that like, you're like, oh, why is this a thing? Like for me, working on Wonderscope, which is a storytelling app for kids, which everybody working on the project had like really great ideas of what they wanted this product to be. They wanted it to be inclusive and diverse, but as always happens, there's sometimes things that get missed. And there were definitely times where I'd be like, okay, I read through the story because one of my job kind of duties was to help them kind of both develop the experiences, but also to create some of the marketing materials. So obviously I would sit through and like listen to the entire story because I have to find the best parts of it to screenshot or whatever. And there definitely be times where I'd be like, hey, like, this sounds very concerning, or have you thought about this, how this might come off? Have you thought about what you're teaching kids when you tell them to do this? And it ultimately came down to me finding the right people who could elevate those concerns to the appropriate people for them to make changes. I will say it definitely is like super frustrating at times when like hey, one, I don't get to actually talk to the decision makers. So am I sure that what I'm conveying is being conveyed accurately to those decision makers? And two, it's always like, oh, I have to go through someone else for my voice to really matter. But I think, again, it's kind of like one of those suck it up and deal with it type deals where like at the end of the day, you are trying to have the best interests of the product or the game or the story in mind. And if you want to be proud of having worked on it, sometimes you have to be the team player and be able to say like, hey, like I tried my best to make this so I could be like proud of putting this on my portfolio or whatever at a later point. And sometimes it's really worth it. And I think that was like definitely a huge part of it for me when it's impacting, for instance, very young folks. Like when I was working on a storytelling app for kids, like that's something that I'm pretty passionate about, not teaching them to do bad things. So it's like, okay, like it sucks that I have to do this, but at some point it's still worth it for me to try speak up about it.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, I think it's really important since gaming is such a big industry and it reaches so many different types of people and young people. Like you're saying, that it's really important that we send the right message when we do that type of work, right? And really, we only have a couple minutes left here, but really, I'd like to get everyone to do a short call to action. What do you think folks should do if they're interested? We have a lot of gamers, game developer adjacent people. What would you like folks to be thinking about or acting on as they work on future gaming projects and how they approach them authentically in the industry?
Let's start with Zach.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, if you're in a hiring position, I always advocate hiring more diverse teams. That's, I think, how we're going to be able to change the industry in the long term. When working on kind of like personal projects, one thing that I always also push for is don't be afraid to be a little bit vulnerable. If you are talking about personal stories, like, yes, it can be very hard to put part of yourself out there, but people do respond to kind of like authenticity and telling those stories that actually do mean something to you, instead of trying to make up a story that people will fall in love with. It's much easier to tell them your story and like be okay with people knowing about it. It's also, for me personally, sometimes very cathartic to be able to get that all out there. So don't be afraid to just put yourself a little bit out there. Don't be afraid to just make something. Yeah.
Lauren.
I'd like to say that whatever you make, whatever you put out into the world, it will have some sort of impact, no matter how small or big the audience may be. And I think it's important to, do your research when you're not sure of something that you're making, and don't pretend to know the experiences of a particular demographic. Always reach out to your network, or just really be mindful, be respectful, and be true.
And Kate.
Yeah, just a few quick things. I would say that if you're a game player, and you want better representation in the games that you play, then demand it. Get on social media. Be nice about it, though. Don't be, raging angry because, it's harder to get listened to that way because there's a lot of angry people on social media. But if you make your case, say, hey, it'd be great if you had this kind of character in this game or this kind of character in this game or whatever. So but demand it, because companies are listening, at all levels, and they do want to strive to do better. That's at least been my experience. If you're on the industry side and working in the game industry, then I think take to heart a lot of what we said about just, before you create, just take a moment to think about the action that you're doing, be conscious about all the decisions you're making. So in other words, create with real intention. So make sure you're really thinking through about why you're doing something in the creative environment. And also strive for, and I mean like push on management for not only doing better hiring with underrepresented people in the environment, because to Zach's point, it's exactly right. It's like, that is how we get more diverse games. Ultimately, is we have more diverse first people making them, especially at the larger company level, but also keep pushing on better working conditions and all of those issues as well, because all of those things affect, of course, people's perception of even wanting to get into the game industry, because they hear a lot of horror stories about this industry, many of which are very justified and true. I mean, just in the last 3 years, we have the scandal at Riot, we had the scandal at Ubisoft, we have the whole problems with Activision Blizzard, which are not going to go away instantly. And so we have to keep pushing on those as people in this industry and be really vocal about it. Because let's face it, evil triumphs when good people do nothing. So we need to stand up and do something, like every day.
Yeah. Well, a really big round of applause to our panelists. This has been an awesome discussion. I love how chat blew up and questions came in. My apologies to folks where we couldn't answer your questions. Would love for you all to tune into other PDXWIT events. The LGBTQ series for Crystal and I is a quarterly event, so we're already thinking of the next one. I love that this was kind of out of the box for us as an org and as a team. You all and this panel made this a really great event. Thank you so much for joining today's PDXWIT event. We hope to see you at a future event, and please reach out to these folks. Their information was thrown in chat. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to PDXWIT. As you exit this game, I believe a survey will come out. We'd love to hear from you. Feedback, any feedback is always good for us as we refine and continue to create programming that you all are interested in and relevant to today's world. Have a great rest of the day and weekend, and we'll see you around the block. Bye all.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.